Hello, everyone. I am coming to you live from Vancouver, British Columbia today. I was in South Bend at Notre Dame, my alma mater, for a few days, attending a conference. I gave comments on a paper by Russ Schaefer-Landau and Terence Cuneo, Russ Schaefer-Landau being the editor of your textbook. Their paper was titled Why Be Moral, which is actually a question that's going to come up now and come up again a couple times in the next few lectures. And now I'm up in Vancouver attending a different conference, the American Philosophical Association Pacific Division meeting. So I'm just recording this in my hotel room. I think that this will probably be a pretty long lecture, but it might be that the ones next week will be a little shorter to make up for that. So what we're going to start talking about here are what are called ethical theories. So ethical theories are going to be theories that attempt to provide general accounts of what fundamentally makes right actions right and wrong actions wrong. Okay? They're going to tell us both which actions are right and wrong, and they're going to tell us why, most fundamentally, they're right or wrong. Is it because the wrong action makes there be less happiness in the world than there could have been? Or is it because it violates somebody's rights? Or because it expresses some sort of vicious disposition in you? That kind of thing. Okay? And one reason that we're going to be interested in ethical theories in our applied ethics class is that if you think you can figure out what the right ethical theory is, it might be that when you come to certain more difficult applied questions, you can look at the right ethical theory and try to derive certain answers from the right ethical theory. So if you are an act utilitarian, you might think actions are right if and only if they maximize well-being, maximize utility. Utility and well-being mean the same thing here. We're talking about well-being in the same sense as in the last lecture, right? So if you're an act utilitarian and you are faced with some difficult moral question, you might look, okay, well, what course of action will maximize overall well-being? And that will be the way that you'll approach the question. If you hold a different moral theory, you might approach it in a different way, right? Now, it is true that we can often make moral judgments without needing to know which ethical theory is true. In fact, we often make moral judgments even if we don't know anything about any ethical theories at all. I've never even thought about the question, what fundamentally makes right actions right or wrong actions wrong. So, for instance, I suspect you all believe that you should not torture babies for fun. But you probably didn't form that belief by deriving it from some general ethical theory, right? You didn't try to figure out, okay, what is it that makes things right or wrong, and then you tried to apply this general account to the question, whether it's okay to torture babies for fun. Instead, you just thought about it and you just directly saw, by way of conscience, by way of intuition, that that's wrong. It's not like you thought about it and said, interesting question, torturing babies for fun. Let me go study ethical theory. I'll get back to you, right? In the same way, you can often, predict how physical objects are going to behave, even, without knowing what the underlying physical theories, the physical laws that govern how they behave are, right? You can predict the trajectory of the ball even if you don't understand the underlying physics, right? Many applied ethics arguments will not appeal to ethical theories. They'll apply to concrete intuitions, or they'll apply to analogies, or things like that. You'll see what all that means as we get into the applied questions. But in that case, if oftentimes we can figure out what's right and wrong perfectly fine without needing to answer this grand theoretical question about ethical theories, why should we care about ethical theory at all? And I'm going to propose at least 2 reasons. This is Philippa Foot. She was a very prominent ethicist at Oxford in the mid-20th century. She came up with a very famous thought experiment you might have heard of before called the Trolley Problem, right? Because it involves a runaway trolley. So here's the trolley problem. You have an out-of-control trolley. It's barreling down the tracks. It's going to hit 5 workers who are performing repairs up ahead. I say here in the text that they're working on a bridge, so they can't just move out of the way. I guess in the drawing they've been tied up by some villain. Doesn't really matter for our purposes. You can divert the trolley so that it hits 1 person instead of 5. You can divert it onto a side track where there's only 1 guy. You know that if you divert it, it will work. You know that there's no other way to save these 5 people. We're not interested in creative, out-of-the-box attempts to solve this, right? We just want, take the situation as given. Should you kill the 1 to save 5? And think about that. Think about what your answer to that is. And think about why you give the answer to that you give. When I ask people this in person, and when they do surveys and stuff, people generally think, yes, divert it. Save the 5 by killing the 1. And they think that there's a very straightforward reason for doing that, right? 5 lives outweighs 1 life. It's sad that this 1 guy has to die, but 5's more than 1, right? Seems simple enough. Well, here's a second case. We've got out-of-control trolley barreling down the tracks, going to hit 5 workers. This time, there is no second try. I promise this is all going to be relevant to ethical theory. Just bear with me for a minute. This time, there is no second track. But there is a very large guy, real buff guy, standing right next to you on this footbridge that goes over the trolley tracks. You can push him onto the tracks, and he will slow down the trolley just enough for the workers to get away in time. You can't jump yourself because you're not big enough. You won't be able to slow it down enough. You're extremely, extremely good at these sorts of snap physics calculations. You have no doubt that what you're thinking is correct here, right? So should you push this guy? And here a lot of people say, no. A lot of people who thought that you should switch in the first case, kill 1 to save 5, say no, they don't like the idea of pushing this guy. And then you might ask, well, wait a minute, why is it? I mean, a minute ago we thought, look, 5 people versus 1 person, you gotta save more people. Is it just that we don't like putting our hands on the guy? It's more visceral, but how could that make any difference, right? You're gonna let 4 additional people die just because you don't want to touch this guy. It would make you feel bad about yourself or something, So on the one hand, a lot of people have the intuition that you shouldn't push this guy, but it can be hard to explain that intuition, right? Some potential explanations might come up later, but just note for now, it can be hard to explain. Now consider yet another case. So you're a doctor in a remote mountain town. You have 5 patients. They all need organ transplants or they'll die. The pass is filled up with snow, not going to melt for months. No hope of getting these people organ transplants in time until a hiker wanders into your clinic. You realize he is a match for all of your patients. You can kill him, and if you distribute his organs to your patients, you can save 5 lives, you're sure that you can falsify the medical records. Oh, he had a heart attack, while he was here. He was actually very sick. Nobody else in the town knows enough about medicine to figure out that you're lying. His body will be long past any autopsy by the time the mountain passes have opened up. And so you think you can get away with this, right? Nobody's going to know that you've killed one to save 5 in order to redistribute his organs. And here, very few people say that you should kill this guy, right? When you ask. Lots of people who said that you should flip the switch in the first case say, no, you can't kill this guy. And yet the initially appealing reasoning, so kill one to save 5, that seems equally true, doesn't it? I remember when I was an undergraduate, my intro to philosophy professor started out by asking us about these 3 exact cases. And he asked about the flipping the lever, and I said, yes, flip the lever. And he asked about pushing the guy, and I realized, I see what he's doing. He's trying to make us give inconsistent answers. And I said, yeah, you got to push the guy. Then he asked us about this one, and I was like, oh, man, it really doesn't seem like you should cut this guy up to redistribute his organs, right? So here, people get kind of puzzled when you present them with situations like this, because most people give different answers, and yet it's hard to explain what the moral difference could be between the first case and the last case that justifies letting 4 extra people die, And there are many other variations of trolley cases. Plenty of trolley cases for days, if you ever care about these. But we'll move on from trolley cases right now. And get to the point. I said this was going to be relevant to ethical theory, right? Now, in a way, of course, trolley problems, kind of dumb, not a very realistic situation, do turn out actually to be relevant to how you should program self-driving cars, for instance. Should they, if they need to swerve to avoid a pedestrian, maybe to avoid a group of pedestrians, but it will endanger the driver, what should they do? Or if there's one group of pedestrians and they have to swerve and hit one guy over here, right? But they do at least illustrate this much. They illustrate that sometimes our ordinary instincts about moral problems don't make much sense. We have the intuition that you should pull the lever. We have the intuition that you shouldn't cut the guy up. We also have the intuition that we can't find the relevant difference, right? Or at least that's how lots of people are. We have sort of conflicting intuitions about, or maybe we can say in the first case we had the intuition that the reason you should switch is you save more people. And yeah, that doesn't work in the last case. So there has to be something more going on, right? And so, our intuitions are not perfectly consistent, or if they are, making them consistent is not always easy. It's not always easy to see exactly what we're responding to in these cases. And, it could be that our judgments are being influenced by things that are morally irrelevant. Maybe we just really don't like the thought of cutting the guy up, but, 4 extra lives are going to be saved. Maybe it just doesn't matter morally that you don't like that. You got to do it, right? Or maybe there really is an important moral difference between these cases. And, we just have trouble spelling it out at first glance. Either way, whether it turns out that our judgments about the cases are right or not, it's something is amiss, right? Either they're all the same and we don't think they are, or they're different, but we have trouble figuring out why. And this is a problem, and it's a problem for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it means that we have to be wrong about some of our judgments, right? Because if all of our judgments aren't consistent, then we have to be wrong about some of them. So sometimes we can't trust our snap judgments. Another thing, the fact that we have kind of different good-sounding principles we can appeal to helps us rationalize in some cases. It might be, people do this in politics a lot when they're deciding what moral principles they want to appeal to. Suppose a policy is going to hurt me in order to help other people. I'm going to get taxed or something, right? I say, no, that violates my rights. You can't hurt one person just to help other people. And that kind of sounds like it makes some sense, right? You can't hurt one person just to help other people. People have rights. Can't override those rights, for the sake of the collective or something. But then when things are the other way around, we're going to hurt other people to help me. I say, you got to do what's for the greatest good. People have to make sacrifices for the common good of society. And that sounds like it makes sense too, right? Both of those things sound good. They can't both be universally correct because they conflict with each other. And what I'm doing here is just I'm just pulling on these things in an unprincipled way to rationalize what I want, to protect my own interests, right? So it's kind of, it can be important that we figure out really what is the right way to reason about these cases for the sake of consistency. Also for the sake of, sometimes, I guess I didn't put this in the slides, but a lot of times we're just not sure. A lot of times we don't have clear intuitions about what to do in a certain case, right? We'll probably talk about some of those when we get to applied ethics. We'll talk about some issues maybe where you feel conflicted or something. And then it might be helpful to have a moral theory too. If we're not sure, we can look back at the moral theory, right? See if it can give us some guidance in a difficult situation. And so it would be nice if we can find out what the right ethical theory is. Something that can tell us what makes the right actions right, what makes the right actions wrong. That might help us figure out in difficult circumstances, or circumstances where we don't have clear intuitions, or where we have conflicting intuitions, or whatever. That might help us figure out what the truth is, figure out which of our snap judgments need to go, that sort of thing. And that might be helpful as we move on in the class. It may also be relevant to another question. This is the topic of the paper that I commented on the other day. Why be moral? When we were talking about well-being, we raised this question. Is the morally right thing always the thing that is best for you? Does it always benefit you to do the morally right thing? And we at least raised as a possibility, maybe not. Maybe morality requires self-sacrifice sometimes. Or maybe it requires that you sacrifice the interests of people that you care about. Maybe some friend of yours has done something very bad. You're wondering whether to turn them in or whatever, right? Maybe sometimes it requires that you sacrifice some cause you care about or some personal project you've been working on or whatever. And in those cases where the demands of morality, if there are such cases, where the demands of morality pull apart from other things that you legitimately have good reason to care about, you might wonder, why is it that you have to behave morally? Maybe you should do the morally wrong thing, right? Christine Korsgaard, famous Kantian, we're going to talk about Kantianism in a minute. She puts it like this. I used this quote before, I think, but it's a very striking quote. The question, why be moral, can become urgent, for the day will come for most of us when what morality commands, obliges, or recommends is hard. That we share decisions with people whose intelligence or integrity don't inspire our confidence. That we assume grave responsibilities to which we feel inadequate. That we sacrifice our lives, or voluntarily relinquish what makes them sweet. And then the question, why, will press, and rightly so. She makes it sound like this question particularly will come up in certain, difficult turning points in your life. It may be that it comes up in your ordinary life too. We'll talk about arguments that say that you should not eat meat, or that you should give a lot of your money away, that kind of stuff. And then, well, that could be very demanding, right? Maybe you don't want to do that. Philosophical discussions of this question, why be moral, go back at least to Plato, very famous philosopher back in the day, probably heard of him. Plato's most prominent book probably is called The Republic. It's written as a philosophical dialogue. That means there are different. It's like a play almost. There are different people talking to each other, testing out arguments, refuting each other, arguing back and forth, this kind of stuff. And at one point, there's a guy named Glaucon who presents a little fable, very, very famous. You should remember this. It's called the Ring of Gyges. So Gyges is a shepherd, and he finds a magic ring that turns him invisible. I put this picture here because this magic ring may remind you of another magic ring in a different story that you have heard before. He's a shepherd, and he finds a magic ring that helps him turn invisible. He realizes that with this ring, he can do anything and get away with it, right? Nobody knows that he did the thing. He can steal, he can kill, whatever, right? And he doesn't face any consequences. So ultimately, he commits a bunch of terrible deeds, and he kills the king, and he seizes control of the kingdom and becomes a tyrant. And Glaucon thinks, look, anybody would do the same thing as Gyges, right? If you had that power, if you really had the power to do anything that you wanted without any possibility of getting caught, without any possibility of facing any repercussions for it, then you would do it. So Gyges thinks. And not only would you do it, but it's what makes sense to do. It would be the only reasonable thing to do. It would be ridiculous to know that you could get away with all these evil deeds and then, just behave like some ordinary person who has to worry about what other people think, that kind of stuff, right? Suppose that there were two such magic rings, and the just like the just person, the person who behaves in accordance with justice. This is a quote from Glaucon. The just put on one of them, and the unjust the other. No man can be imagined to be of such an iron nature that he would stand fast in justice. Then the actions of the just would be as the actions of the unjust. The unjust person, the previously just person would start acting like the unjust person, right? They would both the moral person, the ordinarily moral person, and the ordinarily immoral person would behave the same way if you gave them both this ring, right? If you think of like the best person you know and the worst person you know, if you gave them both this magic ring, they would behave in exactly the same way, go around doing whatever they wanted. And so he says, people are just, they behave morally, not willingly, but of necessity. For wherever anyone thinks he can safely be unjust, there he is unjust. People, in other words, Glaucon thinks, they behave morally because other people, they'll face consequences if they don't behave morally, right? They'll face social consequences, get put in jail, lose their job, whatever, right? People will not be friends with them. And so, in ordinary life, you have on the one hand, the benefits you could get from behaving immorally. On the other hand, you have the benefits you get from people thinking that you behave morally, right? And unfortunately, in ordinary life, you often have to pick because people can tell whether you behave morally or not. But if you didn't, if you could do whatever you wanted and still have people think that you were moral because you had this magic ring that allowed you to avoid accountability, then he thinks you would do all kinds of evil deeds. And not only that, but you would think that was perfectly reasonable. If we could imagine anybody obtaining this power of becoming invisible and never doing any wrong or touching what was another's, he would be thought by the onlookers to be a most wretched idiot. We would think, boy, that chump. Though they would praise him to one another's faces and to keep up appearances with one another from a fear that they too might suffer injustice. So we would say, oh, what a hero, what an admirable person. But really we would be thinking, boy, what a chump. Why doesn't he use his power to just get whatever he wants, right? Um, and Socrates disagrees with Glaucon. He thinks, no, you should be moral, not just so that people think that you're moral or something. And the whole book is Socrates' argument against Glaucon, right? So this is a question Plato takes very seriously. Socrates is another character in the dialogue. And I'll note, I mean, the magic ring is pretty silly. You're probably not going to find a magic ring that turns you invisible. But the general question of people being able to behave immorally and get away with it, that is not fanciful, right? That's very realistic. You got people like Kim Jong-un, say, who can do all sorts of things and get away with it. More mundane examples, also in ordinary life, there are all sorts of power imbalances between people. Some, boss who sexually harasses people or something like that, knows that he can get away with it. I mean, all sorts of stuff where people have the power to do what they want and get away with it. Then when we ask this why be moral question, we need to ask, is that just, that makes perfect sense, that's reasonable, or are they missing something, right? You should do the right thing, even if you could get away with doing the wrong thing. And this will come up when we talk about some of the particular issues in this class in the context of your own life, maybe. Again, we'll talk about whether it's okay to eat meat. Well, if you do, you're going to get away with it, even if it's wrong, right? The animals can't do anything if you eat them. You're not going to face social consequences. It's socially acceptable. If it's wrong, then the reason not to do it is just that it's wrong, I guess, right? Not because you're going to suffer somehow. And then you need to ask, okay, what do you really care about? Or if we talk about this argument that you need to give a lot of your money away, you might not seem like a fun thing to do, right? Give all your money away, and nobody's going to judge you if you don't. So this question, why be moral even when you can get away with it, with being immoral, it might be that is actually really, really important, because maybe it's actually really common that people can get away with being immoral, right? To come back again to the question of ethical theories, different ethical theories. I'm using ethical theory and moral theory interchangeably, by the way. Different moral theories are often going to offer distinctive answers to this question, right? These different theories have different conceptions of what being moral is, and so they sometimes will offer different conceptions of what the point of being moral is, right? So it might be that if we can figure out the right ethical theory, it will help us answer this why be moral question. It might also be that we could maybe determine the right moral theory by considering which answer to the why be moral question seems most plausible. If we find one and we think, okay, I see how, if that is what morality is, I see how it makes sense to behave morally. I see why morality has this kind of authority over us. It can bind us, require us to do things, make it, rationally required to do things. Maybe that's a reason to think, okay, that might be the right moral theory, I'm going over a lot here, I know, but that brings us finally to the question of a specific moral theory, utilitarianism. And we're going to discuss the two major forms of utilitarianism, Act Utilitarianism and Rule Utilitarianism. There are some other versions, but these are the two big ones. Utilitarianism is a form of a view called consequentialism. What consequentialism says is that morality is about producing the best consequences. What makes right actions right is that they produce good consequences. What makes wrong actions wrong is that they don't produce good consequences. Very roughly, it gets more complicated, but and utilitarianism is a specific form of consequentialism. It says the best consequences are those that maximize overall well-being. How do we tell what the best consequences are? We say, well, what is good is well-being. What's good is what's good for people. And the best consequence is the one that provides the most overall well-being. Utilitarians traditionally often use the phrase, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? Overall well-being, meaning well-being for everybody in the world. Add it all up. So, suppose we've got 3 people. Me, David, and Nathan. They're 2 of my high school friends. And I can choose between 3 situations, A, B, and C. And these numbers are like how happy we are, right? Units of happiness. Of course, it's a little artificial to talk about units of happiness, but somehow, people can be more or less happy and stuff. It's not totally artificial, right? There are such things as amounts of happiness, I guess, even if you can't put specific numbers on them. Here we put specific numbers on them to illustrate the point. I can choose between 3 circumstances. And I see in circumstance A, I am best off. Okay, maybe I should pick A. I see in circumstance B, we're all equally well off. Maybe that's good. Also, the worst person is best off in circumstance B, right? I mean, in A, there's somebody at 5. In C, there's somebody at 4. B, the lowest person is at 6. Everybody's at 6. So I've maximized the position of the worst off. Maybe that's something to be said for it. C has the most overall well-being, though. 22 instead of 21 or 18. And so utilitarianism says you've got to pick C. That one has the most well-being overall when we add up everybody's net well-being. And so that's the best consequence. That's the one you should bring about. Basic idea behind the theory. And you might think, okay, maybe that sounds pretty good. Like well-being, maximizing well-being. Sounds pretty good. Sounds like a moral thing to do. Sounds like that might be what morality is all about. Fits with a lot of our intuitions. Promote the common good. Treat everybody's interests equally, whether it's yours or somebody else's. Utilitarianism traditionally was motivated very much by kind of political reform type considerations. People thought by applying the utilitarian formula we can tell like what are good or bad policies, what are good or bad laws, good or bad rules, by asking do they benefit people on the whole or not. And that led lots of the early libertarians to promote ideas which were very progressive for their time. Democracy, civil rights, personal liberty, women's rights, feminism, legalizing homosexuality, abolishing slavery, animal rights, things that were not foregone conclusions back in the 1700s and 1800s, right? So a lot of utilitarians they were kind of ahead of the curve, maybe, right? The earliest forms of utilitarianism show up in Britain in the 16 and 1700s. These folks were, you might say, theological utilitarians. So they thought God commands sort of impartial benevolence of the sort that utilitarianism promotes. Oftentimes later utilitarians would not appeal to anything like this. They were atheists or they just didn't appeal to God or whatever. Early on it was a theologically motivated position. Maybe for some people might still be. The utilitarianism as like a real fully fleshed out doctrine, though. There were these other people who kind of, had early versions of it, but as like a fully fleshed out doctrine, often attributed to Jeremy Bentham, this guy. He was a big political reformer, thought utilitarianism could support a progressive political agenda. Also a very weird guy. He thought maybe people in the future would sort of revere him for founding utilitarianism in the way that people revere like saints or religious leaders now. So he had his body preserved when he died. That's what this picture is of. I mean, it's got what you can see there is mostly artificial, but it's like a mask of his face or whatever. But he had his body preserved so that if his personal friends and other disciples should be disposed to meet together on some day of the year for the purpose of commemorating the founder of the greatest happiness system of morals and legislation, they would have his body around to revere. So he thought, boy, my friends might want to have a day in honor of me, and they might want to wheel my body out when they do. So he had his body preserved, and it's in this cabinet, I think at Cambridge or someplace. So that's a little weird, but his nephew, another very famous utilitarian, was John Stuart Mill. His parents were themselves utilitarians, and they basically, John Stuart Mill was like, like the super soldier ninja who's trained from birth to do, he was going to be like the utilitarian philosopher version of that, I guess. He's going to be the guy who's going to defend utilitarianism. And he was extremely brilliant. He was reading basic Greek at 3, Latin at 8, Plato and Aristotle before he was a teenager, studied economics, later on did all sorts of work in economics. At around 20, he had a very bad nervous breakdown, maybe for reasons you can guess at. But he recovered. He became a very important philosopher, did important work in political theory and economics too, was a member of parliament. He wrote a book called Utilitarianism, and that's probably historically like the single most important statement of utilitarianism. It's John Stuart Mill. Another very prominent utilitarian philosopher, Sidgwick, came a little bit later, near the end of the 1800s. Published a book called The Method of Ethics, which is very important. Probably the single best defense of utilitarianism produced in that era. Also, the way that he approaches the question of trying to decide between different ethical theories was extremely influential. He was a professor at Cambridge, friends with a lot of other very prominent people. He was married to Arthur Balfour's sister. Arthur Balfour later was the prime minister. He also had a kind of big Rasputin-esque beard, I guess, judging from that picture. He famously, this brings us back around to this why be moral question. He famously suggested that following utilitarianism involves acting in accordance with, we might say, the point of view of the universe. From your own point of view, your own kind of biased perspective, your own well-being might seem especially important. You might think, what I need to do is promote my own well-being. But from the point of view of the universe, from the objective, impartial view, everybody's well-being is equally important. And the utilitarian tries to act in accordance with this. We need to be impartially benevolent, right? And so you might wonder, okay, if that's what acting morally is, acting in accordance with the point of view of the universe, why do that? Why adopt the point of view of the universe rather than acting from your own point of view, in accordance with your own interests, right? Sidgwick did not think that he had a totally convincing answer to this question, and this really bothered him. So he came ultimately to think, actually, maybe the only adequate solution was to show that these things are in harmony. Your own self-interest is in harmony with the overall good. Because maybe God exists, and in the afterlife, punishes the wicked and rewards the good. And God judges whether you're wicked or good by asking, did you act in accordance with the common good, promote utilitarianism, right? I mean, act in accordance with utilitarianism, with what's overall best for everybody, right? but he wasn't quite sure. I mean, he was sympathetic to belief in God in a way. He wasn't after. I mean, in the later part of his life, he was not a Christian. He was in the earlier part, and then kind of lost his faith. He continued to be sympathetic to belief in God, but he wasn't quite sure, if it turns out that you need God in order to explain why you should act morally, is that a reason to believe in God? Can we take as given that you should act morally? And therefore, okay, God must exist. Or does that, that doesn't mean that God exists. That just means, maybe we don't have a reason to act morally unless he does, So he wasn't quite sure how he felt about all that. And so he spent a lot of his time in later life going to investigating psychics and spiritualists and these sorts of folks, trying to figure out, are they really communing with spirits? Can we prove empirically that there is an afterlife? And he was the first president of the Society for Psychical Research. Maybe this wasn't quite as weird in the 1800s, like spiritualists and mediums and those sorts of folks were very, they were getting a lot of attention in Victorian England and stuff, I guess. So they wound up debunking a lot of these people. I think they found some cases that he thought were interesting. They thought were interesting, but he was disappointed. He didn't feel like they found conclusive proof of an afterlife through this research, and was dismayed by that. They did think that they found pretty good evidence of telepathy, actually. Yeah, he actually was dismayed by that too, because they were worried. Well, you might think, suppose I know something that I know what your grandpa who died recently. I know what his favorite food was after I do a seance. And that must mean that I really learned from your grandpa's spirit, what his favorite food was. But if telepathy exists, well, maybe I found out from you or from your grandma, or maybe if some living person, I just telepathically picked up on what your grandpa's favorite food was. So he was actually, I think, kind of bothered about the telepathy stuff because he was worried it might explain away some of the evidence that otherwise would be best explained by spirits. Anyway, you don't need to know all that stuff. It's just kind of an interesting fact about Sidgwick. But there are some later utilitarians who think, actually, Sidgwick kind of got it wrong. You don't need an afterlife or anything like that in order to show that you should act in accordance with the point of view of the universe. So these people, Peter Singer and Katarzyna de Lazari Radek, I apologize if I'm saying her name incorrectly, they wrote a book called The Point of View of the Universe, which is about Sidgwick. But they actually argue that, the point of view of the universe is the objectively correct perspective. Understanding their argument requires getting into some things that we're not going to get into in this class, so I can't really go through it. But you might think of this would be a way of arguing that the point of view of the universe is the right one, right? From your perspective, things that are farther away look smaller, right? But if you look at the picture here, actually all these railroad ties are the same size. There's kind of an illusion that's produced by looking at things from your own perspective. If you could somehow look at the tracks from no point of view, the view from nowhere, the point of view of the universe, the really objectively correct way of looking at them, that isn't biased in any way, doesn't have any kind of misleading illusions, then you would see that they're all the same size, right? Maybe selfishness is sort of the same kind of thing. It's kind of a perspectival illusion. From your perspective, maybe your well-being seems especially important, but then we realize, really, objectively, it's not. Everybody's well-being is equally important. And, maybe your sense that yours is especially important is just another kind of illusion. And maybe that, if this objective perspective is the right one, maybe that means, okay, you should care about everybody's interests equally, advance everybody's interests. And if you, don't do that, then you're kind of, you're acting on bad information. You're doing something unreasonable. Or maybe it's, another way, if you want kind of a specifically practical reason-based illusion. Derek Parfit, a philosopher, gives this example of someone who only cares about, he cares about his future well-being, but not on future Tuesdays. He doesn't care what happens to him on Tuesdays in the future. So if you tell him, he's going to have a really bad migraine headache in a few days, he's like, oh man, that's terrible. And then I say, it's going to happen on Tuesday. Then he says, who cares, right? He won't take any steps to avoid bad things that are going to happen to him on Tuesdays in the future. This person clearly is irrational, right? This person is missing something. Why is he missing something? Because it really doesn't make any difference whether the future thing happens on Tuesday or not, right? Objectively, all the days in the future are, your well-being on all the days in the future is equally valuable, right? Even from the perspective of just your own self-interest, right? It's irrational to arbitrarily privilege days that aren't Tuesdays. And maybe it turns out arbitrarily caring about your own self-interest more than the self-interest of other people is like caring about what happens to you in the future based on which day of the week it happens on. Because you're drawing this arbitrary, unjustifiable distinction, right? And caring about things more or less based on this arbitrary distinction. What happens to you in the future matters just as much, whether it happens on Tuesday or not. Well, what happens to some person matters just as much, whether it happens to you or not, right? Maybe, I don't know if that helps or not. If what I just said was more confusing than enlightening, you don't need to worry about it. What Lazari, Radek, and Singer argue is basically that we have kind of reasons from evolution to think that our tendency to be biased towards ourselves is a real kind of irrational bias that's created that can be explained by the fact that it helped our ancestors survive and this sort of stuff. But the real insight of reason is looking at things from the impartial utilitarian perspective. We don't need to get into that. But what you should get, though, is, this is a kind of consequentialist utilitarian answer to the why be moral question. Well, everybody's well-being objectively matters just as much, and so that's what you should care about. Overall aggregate well-being, right? Now, the simplest form of utilitarianism is what's called Act Utilitarianism. That says you should always perform the action that maximizes overall expected utility. Expected utility means it's like don't worry about it. It has to do with how to calculate, it has to do with evaluating actions when you're uncertain about what will happen. So probably this thing will be fine, but there's like a 1% chance it could cause something really bad to happen. What you do is an expected utility calculation where actually we'll talk about this later with regard to a certain applied issue. Don't worry about what expected utility means right now. Just figure what the Act Utilitarian says is you need to do the action that maximizes overall well-being, right? And again, you might think, okay, how could it be wrong to do the thing that is best to people overall, right? Best for people overall. Seems intuitive enough. But there are a lot of people who reject Act Utilitarianism. It's actually very controversial. So the article that I had you read presents three... by the way, the reason that I had you read this online article rather than something from your textbook, the readings on ethical theory in your textbook are all classical reading. They're like from like John Stuart Mill and stuff from the 1800s. And I just think that they're way too hard for undergrads. I don't think you guys would get much out of that. Because it's, it's written in this old-timey style, and it's not written in an accessible way. So that's why I assigned you this other thing. I hope that the article I assigned was better, at least, than that in terms of being comprehensible. But the article focuses on three objections that we're going to discuss. The wrong answers objection. This is when we talk about counterexamples. This is the claim that there are counterexamples to utilitarianism. The undermining trust objection and the partiality / too demanding objections. Okay. So a lot of people think Act Utilitarianism gives the wrong answers in certain cases. And these serve as counterexamples. Generally speaking, these counterexamples are going to be cases where you can harm one person to provide more benefits to other people, but it doesn't seem like you should intuitively, right? But according to Act Utilitarianism, you should, because the aggregate benefit to the other people is going to outweigh the harm to the one person. If a judge can prevent riots that will cause many deaths only by convicting an innocent person of a crime and imposing a severe punishment, Act Utilitarianism implies that the judge should convict and punish the innocent person. So you've got an innocent person in front of you, and you can execute them, but if you don't execute them, there will be rioting and 2 people will die. Should you execute this innocent person to prevent 2 deaths? A lot of people think not. Or this transplant case from earlier. Should the doctor kill the guy to distribute his organs to 5 people? Looks like Act Utilitarianism says, yeah, if you're really sure you can get away with it, this will have the best consequences. Kill the guy. A person makes a promise, but breaking the promise allows that person to perform an action that creates just slightly more well-being. I promised to help my friend move, and I'm going to his house to help him move, and then I see, the food kitchen is asking for volunteers, so I just walk into the food kitchen instead. I figure, well, that will do more good than helping my friend move, and I break my promise to my friend. Then that's the thing to do, right? Break my promise to my friend, because that will do more good. And in all of these cases, people think, this doesn't seem right, does it? Looks like Act Utilitarianism is telling us to do things that are actually wrong because they'll be best, for overall well-being. Another case from Tim Scanlon, we'll talk about him more later. But suppose Jones has suffered an accident in the transmitter room of a television station. Electrical equipment has fallen on his arm, and we cannot rescue him without turning off the transmitter for 15 minutes. So this guy is getting badly electrocuted, and unfortunately a World Cup match is in progress, and we'll have to interrupt the World Cup for 15 minutes to save Jones while he's getting painfully electrocuted. And of course, there's like millions and millions of people watching the World Cup match. So, it's not very bad for any of these people to have the World Cup interrupted for 15 minutes. But, if you think like each of these people loses one unit of utility because we turn it off, that's like millions of units of utility lost, right? Whereas Jones, maybe he's losing like 1,000 units of utility from getting electrocuted, but like that's just one guy. So actually, Act Utilitarianism implies it would be incredibly bad to turn off the transmitter and make each of the viewers lose a little bit of utility in order to save Jones, to prevent him from suffering really badly. And Scanlon thinks, intuitively that's not correct, right? Intuitively you should save Jones even if you inconvenience a large number of people a little bit. There's also this little comic. This guy got his bike stolen. He was sad. But then he thinks, well, whoever stole it was probably more happy to get it than he was sad to lose it, so he figures total happiness in the world increased. So whatever. People make fun of this comic sometimes, like a meme, because it's kind of an odd thought to have, right? I mean, is it okay to steal somebody's thing because you want it more? You know, like, well, if it will increase total happiness in the world, or should that be your reaction? Like, well, if the other guy wanted it more, I guess he can have it, even though it was mine. I guess, that seems to be what Act Utilitarianism says. Generally speaking, it looks like probably Act Utilitarians will have to bite the bullet. They'll have to say, yeah, that's what our theory says. We just shouldn't trust intuition to the contrary. Maybe, again, the thought that you shouldn't do these things is a kind of illusion of some sort. Or, maybe we're being misled because these cases are so unusual. I mean, usually if you're a doctor and you kill somebody to distribute his organs, you are going to get caught, and then people will worry about going to the doctor. And all of these cases, we have to usually judges shouldn't execute innocent people, right? So maybe these cases are unusual, and that kind of screws up our intuitions or something like that. Somehow or other, Act Utilitarians are probably going to have to bite the bullet. Say, yeah, this is what my theory says. Too bad. Another worry is, well, maybe Act Utilitarianism in an important way would be self-defeating. Imagine everybody tries to behave like Act Utilitarians. Would that maximize utility? You might think, well, maybe not. For one thing, it might be very hard for these people to trust each other. Suppose you know that your friends regard promise breaking in the way we were talking about a minute ago, right? They could make a promise to you, but then if they break the promise and it will do even slightly more good, they'll break the promise, right? They'll lie to you if they think it will do slightly more good. They'll cheat. They'll violate the law. They'll kill somebody if they think it will do slightly more good. And if people behave like that, society is going to break down, isn't it? I mean, how could you trust people to keep their promises? You sell something to some guy, and he says, "Yeah, I'm going to pay you tomorrow," and then he gives the money away to charity instead because it will do more good. Now how could you how could you have contracts? How can you have promises? How can you have friendships? People's behavior would lack the kind of predictability and consistency that are required to sustain social trust and stability. So maybe Act Utilitarianism is self-defeating in the sense that if people behave like Act Utilitarians, they'll actually undermine what Act Utilitarians want. They'll fail to maximize utility. Maybe also, maybe people will rationalize and things like that. If I think that lying is okay whenever it maximizes good consequences, I might lie in cases where it doesn't maximize good consequences because I come up with some rationalization. If I think I can steal your bike just because I want it more, then yeah, I'm going to think yeah, I do want it more. I bet I do. Yeah, this will max it. Yeah, and then I get, oh wow, I get the bike. How convenient. So you might have people making mistakes, doing things that don't really maximize utility because they talk themselves into it, right? Usually Act Utilitarians respond to this by saying, yes, it actually would be bad if everybody tried to act like Act Utilitarians. We actually don't want to go around telling everybody that they should consciously be trying to maximize utility all the time. So they're instead going to endorse what's called an esoteric conception of morality. What that means is they think things go better, morally speaking, if people don't try to follow the correct rules of morality. Maybe even if they don't know that those are the correct rules of morality. In most cases, people should just follow common sense rules. Keep your promises unless something really bad will happen or something like that. You should only actually try to think in utilitarian terms in certain special cases where ordinary rules break down. Maybe even you want to hide the truth about utilitarianism from most people. Only an educated group of people or who've really thought through and can understand the dangers, can handle the truth, something like that. So yeah, they'll say usually like, yeah, actually, it's right that it would be bad if everybody tried to act like Act Utilitarians. So don't. It's still the correct account of morality. It's just you have to kind of get at it in a roundabout way. Maybe it's like if you try really hard to go to sleep, you're not going to go to sleep. You have to kind of make yourself fall asleep in a roundabout way. If you try really hard to maximize utility, maybe you're not going to do it. You have to maximize it in kind of a roundabout way. Then this third line of attack. So utilitarianism asks us to consider everybody's interests equally. And you think, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But where does that leave room for, giving any kind of special preference, say, to people that you care about or to your own interests? People often think that you have what are called special obligations. Maybe you're actually required to put special weight on the interests of certain people who are close to you, with whom you have special relationships. You could feed your own kids, but then you realize there's like hungrier kids down the street, so you go feed them instead. A lot of people think that would be wrong, or even just you want to get your kids a gift, but you realize there are people in the world who lack basic necessities, so you give all your money away. You can't even give your friends a gift. That's wrong. It's really demanding. Act Utilitarianism is really, really demanding, and it doesn't seem to leave room for special connections or for putting yourself first, that sort of thing. And so you might think, well, first of all, this fails to recognize the moral legitimacy of giving special preferences to ourselves and people we know and care about. You might think, no, actually, you should care particularly about, your children or your spouse or whatever. And second, demanding that I care so much about complete strangers, not just that I care about them, but that I care as much about them as I do about myself or about my best friend or whatever, that's too demanding. It asks too much, more than can be reasonably expected. The point of view of the universe is nice, but I'm not the universe, bud. I'm just me. You can only demand so much. There's a song called there's a band called the 21st Century Monads, which releases like philosophy themed songs. They have a song called Utilitarian Girlfriend, where this guy is lamenting his girlfriend is a utilitarian, so she's constantly she'll sleep with somebody else as long as she thinks that he won't find out, because she figures, well, it won't hurt him, and it will slightly increase the amount of utility in the world, and all this sort of stuff. And at the end, she breaks up with him, but first she steals all his money so she can give it to charity, because other people need it more than he does. You might think the utilitarian girlfriend really not behaving morally. You should be willing to put some kind of special emphasis on the priority of people close to you. You shouldn't steal stuff from them even if other people need it more. Act Utilitarians may again just have to bite the bullet here. Now they won't. Now they will admit this much. I mean, they'll say, look, if you don't give yourself special priority, you might get burnt out, for instance. Or if you don't give special priority to people around you, that may get you burnt out. That may decrease your ability to help even strangers in the long run and stuff. So it may be that some of these tendencies promote utility, particularly given the way that human beings are constructed or whatever. But they'll say, at the ideal level, these are selfish tendencies that don't have moral importance. At the ideal level, it would be good if you could care about everybody equally. And, that ideally would be the thing to do. This selfish sort of tendency has to be overcome. Or ideally should be overcome as much as we feasibly can. So I hope that makes sense. On the other hand, though, if you are kind of sympathetic to the basic idea of utilitarianism, but you're worried about these sorts of objections, you might be drawn to what's called rule utilitarianism instead. So that's going to ask us to consider which rules would have the best consequences if they were generally followed. And it says right actions are the ones in accordance with those rules. So you don't just look at actions in isolation. The thought is, what sort of rules would you want people to follow in general? What sorts of rules would produce most overall well-being if people followed them? And then it says, what you should do is follow those rules. And you think, okay, well, what sorts of rules would we ask people to follow? I mean, even Act Utilitarians agreed, remember, like, don't tell everybody to follow Act Utilitarianism. That would be bad, right? What sorts of rules do we want people to follow? Well, they need to be easy to follow. You don't want them to be super complicated. You don't want me trying to do complicated calculations all the time. You want them to minimize the potential for abuse, rationalization, make our actions predictable, trustworthy to others. And so that means they're going to be a lot closer to ordinary morality, right? The rules will be things, the rules won't say, steal somebody's bike if it maximizes utility. They'll say, don't steal somebody's bike outside of, emergency situations or whatever, right? If you need to do it to get somebody to the hospital in time, okay, then that's different. But ordinarily, don't steal somebody's bike even if you think you want it more, right? Don't kill people outside of special emergency situations. Keep your promises outside of special emergency situations. There might be exceptions to some of the rules, Again, if you need to, break a promise to take somebody to the hospital who's going to die, okay. But you'll just want sort of narrowly defined, well-defined exceptions that apply in unusual circumstances. Usually people should just follow, don't kill people, keep your promises, don't steal stuff, don't lie. The rules will just contain exceptions for sort of special cases. But generally people are going to behave about the way that you think people normally should behave, right? The way that you normally think people should behave. We can see this by looking back at the sorts of things we were saying a minute ago. If people follow the rule, do whatever will maximize good consequences. That's the rule that they apply when they're trying to figure out whether to keep their promises, as opposed to just the rule, keep promises outside of emergency situations and stuff. Probably going to do worse, because they're not going to trust one another. They might break promises, even when it has bad consequences, because they rationalize it, and so on. This view will avoid, probably, the major criticisms of Act Utilitarianism. Probably avoids the counterexamples and implies, look, in general, if doctors killed their patients to redistribute their organs, that would probably be bad. People wouldn't want to go to the doctor, stuff like that. That wouldn't be a good practice in general. So the right rules will forbid doctors doing that. Might help us avoid the partiality and demandingness objections. If you demand that everybody, just given human nature, if you demand that everybody cares much about everybody equally, as they care about themselves or the people they love, that's probably not going to work very well. People aren't going to do it. They're going to get burned out, demoralized. You want people to be allowed to care about, the people closest to them, makes the rules easier to follow. They can go along with it, more realistic. Creates a kind of division of labor. Might make more sense to have each person care about their own kids and take care of their own kids rather than, oh man, I've got to worry about all the kids in the world and try to figure out, who can I help the most at any given time. So rule utilitarianism might get results that are closer to ordinary morality. At the same time, there are objections to that too. We're going to talk about the rule worship objection and the crude concepts objection. There's another famous one called the claps objection. We're not going to worry about that. I think it can be gotten around. Maybe the others can be gotten around too, but I think the claps one is particularly easy to get around, actually, so we just won't worry about it. So here's the rule worship objection. Rule utilitarianism is going to tell me there are times when a rule forbids my doing something, even though it will have the best consequences, right? It's going to tell me that even though it will be best to kill this guy and cut him up, I can't do it. But an act utilitarian is going to think this is really problematic. Look, we were supposed to be attracted to utilitarianism because we cared about well-being. We cared about making people better off. We cared about making as many people as well off as possible. Now you're going to tell me I can't do that just because this rule tells me that I can't. And he thinks that is irrationally worshiping the rule, by which he means following the rules even when they don't make sense, even when they're not conducive to good results. Like, yeah, usually this is a good rule, but in this case, it gives the wrong result. It tells me to do something that's not going to have the best consequences. And he thinks in that case, it doesn't make sense to follow the rule, right? We cared about utilitarianism because we cared about the consequences. If the rule tells me to do something and doesn't have the best consequences, why am I going to follow it? You tell me, well, if people in general didn't follow this rule, yeah, but I'm talking about my own action, right? If I can do the most good by breaking the rule, he thinks I should break the rule. And I take it that the rule utilitarian is going to have to just kind of reiterate what we said a minute ago. Okay, but if you don't want people in general to behave that way, maybe we do want them following the rules, right? Maybe you should be willing. Maybe what you should be concerned about is not trying to, maybe it's not really your business to maximize overall utility through your own actions personally. Maybe what these rules show us is how each of us can kind of do our part in this big project, that if we all do our part, we'll produce the best consequences or something like that. I don't know if that part made sense. But, I take it, one way to think about it is just, well, look, we've seen these problems that arise if you just do the act utilitarian thing, focus just on the act, and maybe that's why you should move to the rule based conception of what you should do. There are other much more complicated things that rule utilitarians say, but we don't need to get into all that. This crude concepts objection, it's framed in the piece, I think, as an objection to rule utilitarianism, but it would work equally well against act utilitarianism too. Here's the thought. Maybe rule utilitarianism can get us the right results. It can tell us, plausible sounding things about when you should keep promises and blah, blah, blah. All the same, maybe it doesn't give the intuitively correct explanation of why you have the obligations that you do. Okay, rule utilitarianism says the doctor shouldn't kill you to distribute your organs to 5 other people. Okay, yeah, fair enough. But why is that? It's going to have to say something about aggregate well-being. The answer is, well, if doctors generally did that, then it would have bad consequences, blah, blah, blah. But some people think, no, that doesn't seem right. Like, it's not... The reason that I shouldn't kill you to distribute your organs isn't because of overall well-being and, that kind of stuff. It's because of you. It's because of, your rights, your dignity. Something that isn't... And, where those things aren't derived from considerations about the collective welfare or whatever, but they're just derived from you and your inherent properties. And so maybe ruled utilitarianism kind of oversimplifies certain things. Even if it gets the right result, it thinks that the right result is everything is explained by these facts about what would maximize overall well-being, and maybe that's not the right answer. We'll see when we discuss Kantianism a very different kind of explanation about why I shouldn't cut you up. If the contrast class is not clear, if you're not quite understanding what does this objector think we should say instead, Kantianism will offer us a different kind of explanation. I take it probably the best way to evaluate that is just to look at these different explanations. Okay, are these other views more or less plausible? And that's what we're going to be doing. Do these other views have more plausible explanations of why we should do the right thing? So